Okay, there's the Cathedral of Chartres, Notre Dame de Chartres. For like many of the great Gothic churches in France, it is dedicated to the Virgin Mary, and there are more churches dedicated to her now than to any other saint. The 12th century witnessed a great rise in her popularity. The Gothic was her age, as Kenneth Clark says. Various unconvincing reasons are given for this, but the idealization of women in the poetry of the troubadours seems to be at least a related phenomenon. In any case, there was a church here dedicated to her as early as the 6th century, and Chartres was always looked upon as the real center of devotion to her in France. The church possesses what is alleged to be the tunic worn by her at the Nativity, which was donated to it by Charles the Bald back in the 9th century. A fire here in 1134 badly damaged the west part of the Romanesque church that was here then, and it was rebuilt as you see it now within the next half century. Then in 1194 there was another fire that damaged the rest of the remaining part of the Romanesque church to the extent that it was thought necessary to rebuild it after that. It seems a little suspicious that, and I don't remember my source for this, between 1150 and 1250, something like 500 churches in France, including 80 cathedrals, were rebuilt after roof fires, most of which were alleged to have been caused by lightning. Be that as it may, the south tower on the right was built in the 12th century with the rest of the facade. The north tower wasn't finished until after 1500 in the later flamboyant Gothic fashion. And Henry Adams says you can judge whether or not you have good taste by whether you prefer the south tower or the north. He says the south one owes its beauty to proportion and geometry and calls it the most perfect piece of architecture in the world. On the other hand, he says the north one looks like an aging woman with too many jewels around her neck. He also compares the south one to the Virgin herself, the north one to Diane de Poitiers. The north one is, however, the highest in France, reaching to 350 feet. Chartres also has the oldest stained glass ensemble of any size in those three windows, and that is also the largest rose window in France. Chartres probably has more sculptural decoration than any other church. Will Durant claims it has 10,000 figures. Malcolm Miller, who is obsessed with the place and has probably actually counted the statues, says there are 2,000. In any case, in a century and a half, we've come a long way from the half dozen or so we saw at Tournus. The facade sculpture is the earliest, and this is the tympanum of the southern entrance, sometimes called the Incarnation Portal. In the lowest register, the Virgin lies below her Son in a kind of bunk bed arrangement with the Annunciation and Visitation to the left and the shepherds arriving on the right. Above that is the Presentation in the Temple, and above that the Virgin and Child enthroned and surrounded by figures representing the seven liberal arts and their classical expositors like Aristotle, Pythagoras, and Ptolemy. This is another example, a pretty remarkable one, of the Church's effort to associate itself with the best of pre-Christian civilization. And Albertus Magnus, in fact, claimed that the Virgin had perfect knowledge of all these subjects. Chartres never had a university, but the cathedral school was famous for its focus on classicism and especially on Platonism, though Plato is not thought to be among the figures here. This is the central portal. The threatening last judgment of the Romanesque has here been replaced by a more benign vision of the Lord surrounded by the symbols of the evangelists, although the figures in the archivolts are probably supposed to be the 24 elders of the book of Revelation. The 12 apostles plus 2 angels decorate the lintel, and Old Testament heroes stand in the jambs. The latter still look very much like sort of humanized columns. If you hold them in your mind's eye a moment, you'll be able to see a real movement toward naturalism as we go around to the north and south porches. This is the north entrance tympanum on the facade, and it is thought to represent either the Ascension or Pentecost, the descent of the Holy Spirit upon the apostles. The archivolts here contain the symbols of the zodiac and the labors associated with the months, and these are common enough subjects in Christian iconography, although exactly how their placement in such a context as this is to be justified isn't entirely clear. The usual view is that they in some way represent the church's rule over time and space, which may be on the right track. It is certainly true, at least, that people in the Middle Ages thought of the progress of the year much more as a succession of religious events, saints' days, festivals, and so on, than most of us do now. This is the north porch of Chartres now, and one reason why the church has more sculpture than any other is the presence of its two large porches like this. The Old Testament is usually the source of subject matter for the north side of a church because, I suppose, it's darker, unilluminated as it were, colder. In contrast, the south sides of churches like this can then be associated with the bright light and warmth of revelation and salvation or something like that. The gem statues are Old Testament, but the central doorway depicts the dormition and resurrection of the Virgin on the lintel below and her coronation above. Here you can see some of the jam statues up closer. Melchizedek is at the left, and next to him are Abraham and Isaac, followed by Moses, Samuel, and David. These figures were done in the early 13th century, some 50 years after the facade statues, and are clearly more lifelike and natural, even if still a bit unnaturally saintly looking. Besides such statues as these, says Kenneth Clark, the Greeks look arrogant and soulless. The north porch as a whole was decorated between about 1230 and 1300. This is the south porch, which is devoted to more specifically Christian theology. The tympanum over the central door has the group known as the Deesis in it: Jesus, Mary, and John the Baptist. In this close-up of the right-hand bay, you can see some of the post-biblical saints now, including from left to right, Martin, Jerome, Gregory. Although some of the figures on the north side may be later, the sculptor of these statues has made them look almost like real men standing on pedestals. They look impressive, but not artificially holy, like the north side figures. This is the figure of Jesus on the trumeau of the central south porch portal. Blanche of Castile was involved in financing the decoration of the north side of the church, including the windows, and the man who had been her main political opponent, Pierre de Dreux, the Comte de Bretagne, helped pay for the south side. We'll see their respective coats of arms inside in a minute, but this is thought to be Pierre below the feet of Christ. It's not certain what's going on here, but some think he's offering bread to the poor in the scene above, and that he is sitting now headless below with his wife, Alex, to the right, and an unidentified person to the left. Pierre did go on Louis's first crusade and died on it, so Blanche thought better of him after that. This is the interior of the church now, looking toward the entrance at the west. Although they are washed out in this photo, those are the same windows we saw earlier from outside, the three lancets, which are the oldest anywhere, and the big rows above them. You can also see the three-story nave now, which became more popular than the four-story arrangement of the 12th century, and there are now colonnettes beside all the nave piers. The vault is quadripartite. Each bay is divided into 4 parts instead of 6, as was the fashion in the earlier Gothic churches we've seen. But since there are more bays, the effect is to make the ceiling look more web-like rather than less. The stained glass at Chartres is especially famous, and almost all of it is 13th century, with the exception of the west lancet, which, as I said, are 12th, and the effect of this glass does a lot to create what Henry Adams and Kenneth Clark call one of the 2 greatest covered spaces in the world. The color in the glass is all due to chemicals, cobalt, magnesium, iron, and so on, added in the manufacture of the glass itself. No color was painted on in the 12th or 13th centuries except black, in effect to block color and light out. While we see some of what Henry Adams calls then the greatest color decoration in the world, the great glass gods of Chartres up close, we'll hear another piece of music arranged in 4-part harmony by Perotinus, the choir master of Notre Dame in Paris. This is the hymn Cede run Principes in the fashionable new polyphonic style from the proper for St. Stephen's Day. Here are the 3 western lancets now. The one on the right, the tree of Jesse with the genealogy of Christ, is the oldest of all. Here it is by itself now. And this is Jesse, the father of David, with the family tree sprouting from him. This is the Passion window, the one on the left. This is the Last Supper from that window. This is part of the central window devoted to the life of Christ. This is the south transept rose, and in the middle lancet window below it, you can see the black and yellow checkerboard shield of Pierre de Bretagne. And this is the north transept rose, and you can see here the castles and lilies from the coat of arms of Blanche of Castile in the small windows just below and to the left and right of it. Here now is the Cathedral of Reims, begun in 1211. Art historians don't always use terminology in the same way, but the Gothic churches we've seen so far are, as I've said, usually put in the classic style, and the churches of the 13th century are put in the lyrical or Rayonnant style, and I should say that Chartres is also often classified as Rayonnant because, apart from the facade, it is 13th century. The term Rayonnant refers specifically to the greater use of stained glass, which we saw evident there. Then the later churches of the 14th and 15th centuries are usually called flamboyant and are characterized by what is considered excessive decoration for its own sake, as in the case again of the North Tower at Chartres. The Cathedral of Reims is certainly one of the finest overall examples of the Rayonnant style, the 13th century style. And Will Durant says that if it had gotten the facade towers which were intended, it would be the noblest work of man. St. Louis was crowned here as a boy in 1226 when only the choir had been finished, and every king of France after him till the Revolution, with the exception of Henry IV, was crowned here. And several others before him were crowned at Reims, if not in the church as we see it now as well, including his father and grandfather. Tradition says that holy oil was sent down from heaven for the anointing of Clovis after his baptism here by Saint Remy in the 5th century, and that some drops of the oil were used for each subsequent ceremony. This is the center of the facade, and you can see that the tympanum is here replaced by stained glass, though it's all modern. Reims has unfortunately been in the path of armies invading France for 1,000 years, and the cathedral suffered especially in the 2 world wars. To the right of the central entrance is the Annunciation, which you see now, including the famous smiling angel. This is the choir looking east now, and we have again the 3-story configuration with giant windows above, so that well over half the back wall is glass. And looking toward the west entrance now, you can see just how much of it is also glass. Here it is up closer, and you can see some of the unusual sculptural decoration on the east side of the arch at the entrance to the nave. A lot of these figures are very interesting, but it's difficult to get pictures of them. Here's one pair, Melchizedek and Abraham, in the popular foreshadowing of the Mass, as the former offers the latter bread and wine. Abraham could be a crusader taking Holy Communion, though. Looks just like Charlton Heston, actually. This is a model of what the west end of the Ile de la Cité in Paris was like around this time, and in the center of this picture is the royal palace. The Louvre was rarely a residence for any length of time in the Middle Ages, and the palace here on the Ile was the favored place until, as we'll see in the fall, Charles V refurbished the Louvre in the late 14th century, but then he abandoned it for the Hotel St. Paul at the east end of the city, and in the 15th century the favorite residence would be the Hotel de Tournelle, where the Place de Vosges is now. Only in the 16th century did the Louvre start to take on the character of a royal palace, but even after that it was only irregularly a residence. On the north, abutting on the river, you can see the towers which still stand, built by Philip IV, St. Louis's grandson, in the early 14th century here, and below them the palace proper, some parts of which also survive, and below that the Sainte-Chapelle, the royal palace chapel built by St. Louis between 1246 and 1248, just before he left on his first crusade. This is the way the chapel looks today. This building is 135 feet high. The walls are 3/4 glass, and yet there are no flying buttresses. In 1236, Baldwin II, the king of Constantinople, had pawned some holy relics, including the crown of thorns, to some Venetian bankers in exchange for ready cash. Louis bought them in turn from the Venetians and built this as a kind of giant reliquary to house them. This is the lower floor, which is decorated in what may have been the original way, with lilies, the lilies and castles of Queen Mother Blanche. This is in itself a pretty impressive place, and I've seen tourists come in, look around, and then leave, commenting that it's nice, but perhaps overrated. But this basement is not what you come here to see. What you want to see is upstairs. And this is the real Sainte-Chapelle now. The main architect was probably Pierre de Montereau, or Montreuil, who was also one of the 13th century architects who worked on Notre Dame in Paris. There are approximately 1,200 individual episodes in the glass, and over half of the whole is original. There's considerably more 13th century glass here than at Notre Dame, despite the abuse this building suffered during the Revolution when it was used as a warehouse to store sugar. The relics which were displayed in the tabernacle at the far end were thrown out at that time. The recess on the left was used as a kind of private box for members of the royal family in Louis IX's day. In this picture you can see some of the glass up closer. It is common to hear it said that stained glass like this served as something like the Bible for the poor, as though the average street person could come in here and learn all about Christian theology just looking at it. Well, what do you think? To start with, most of the glass here, as well as that in most of the cathedrals, is so high up it requires binoculars to make it out at all. And even with binoculars, few 13th century churchgoers would have been able to make any sense of it. Even today, scholars who specialize in Christian iconography are at a loss to explain many of the scenes. The programs of such ensembles as this were worked out by the most bibliophile theologians of the age and were emphatically not intended as anything like an educational tool for their inferiors. Ordinary Christians were just left, as we are today, to marvel at the overall effect. This now is Mont Saint-Michel off the coast of Normandy, and it's pretty much in a class by itself. It's part Romanesque and part Gothic like a lot of abbeys, but an architectural and engineering accomplishment like few other things in France. Before 708, apparently, much of what is now the bay here was dry land. In that year, Saint Aubert of Avranches is said to have received a vision in which he was commanded to build a shrine here in honor of Saint Michael, Saint-Michel. But when the men whom he sent to get relics for the altar from a similar shrine at Monte Gargano in Italy returned, they found the mount surrounded by the sea, and apparently some geological event did in fact take place then which produced this result. In this picture you can get a better idea of the architectural history of the place. Nothing is left of Aubert's original shrine, but in the 11th century a Romanesque abbey and church were built here. During the fighting between John and Philip Augustus, the English got possession of it, and in driving them out, serious damage was done to the abbey buildings on the north side. And Philip resolved to have this repaired. The result was what came to be known as the Marvel, La Merveille, the new abbey, just the roof of which shows in this picture. In the 15th century, the Romanesque choir fell down the hill and was replaced by a late Gothic one to the east of the central tower, and in the 18th century, the original Romanesque western entrance of the church itself was raised when it was also threatening to collapse. Now you're looking up at the Abbey building. You can imagine how difficult this was to construct and why it was considered a marvel, a miracle. It consists essentially of 6 large sections, 2 each on 3 levels. And on the bottom level here are the former hostelry for pilgrims and the storage cellar. Above that are the so-called guests' hall and knights' hall, and then on top the refectory and the cloister. This is the refectory or monk's dining room. This is the so-called dining hall or guests' hall. This is, of course, a monastery, but all these rooms had non-liturgical, non-religious purposes, so in effect, you're also seeing the Gothic here used as it might have been in the royal palace or some other fine 13th century residences. This is called the Knights' Hall. We're going to hear a piece of music now while we see some more of Mont Saint-Michel. This is going to be the Curie from the 13th century gradual of Eleanor of Brittany, who was the daughter of Jean II, Duke of Brittany, and became the abbess of the famous convent of Fontevraud, where Henry II, Eleanor of Aquitaine, and Richard the Lionhearted were all buried. This is a troped Curie, that is, a poem, in this case, Orbis Factor Est, he is the creator of the world, is sung in such an arrangement by a soloist while the choir intones the Kyrie proper. This was a common sort of practice in the Middle Ages, but was forbidden by the Council of Trent in the 16th century when other embellishments of the Mass, like sequences, were also almost entirely eliminated as distractions from the essence of the service. Masses, it was felt, had become too much like theatrical performances rather than religious ceremonies. This is the cloister now, which is actually on top of the Abbey building. It was the only level place they had for it. This is the other side of the mount now, which has the abbot's residence and the monks' living quarters, and there are apparently about a dozen monks living here now as a sort of skeleton crew, although the place is owned and maintained by the state. The Bay of Mont Saint-Michel is famous for its tides. The water goes in and out something like 10 miles because the beach is so shallow. And more than one tourist has found himself in trouble here since, according to the Bayeux Tapestry anyway, William the Conqueror and Harold of England nearly drowned riding around the place. You can see the modern causeway meant to make the approach safe, but people still park carelessly and return to find their cars half buried in quicksand. Well, now you're in England, and because of the destruction that took place there during the Reformation, there are not a lot of abbeys which are either Romanesque or Gothic surviving other than as ruins. But there are more Gothic ones than Romanesque ones, and again, I'm not sure there's any convincing general reason for this. This is the former Gothic abbey of Much Wenlock, founded southeast of Shrewsbury by the famous Lady Godiva, and it was one of the few Cluniac establishments in England. The Cistercians were a much bigger success in England, and this is Rievaulx Abbey, which was among the first Cistercian monasteries to be established there. It's in Yorkshire. As I mentioned earlier, the Cistercians favored the flat East End. You're hearing another troped Curie. This is from an English Cistercian source, in fact, and it's called the Curie Rex Anglorum, King of the English. And in this picture, you're looking through Rievaulx Abbey toward the East End. In the fall, we'll hear more about what else went on in England after John's death in 1216 and the accession of his long-lived but undistinguished son, Henry III. But we're going to see a representative selection of early English Gothic churches now while we're on the subject of architecture. There will be more English Gothic churches to see in that series as well, because many of the most well-known examples, like Westminster Abbey and the Cathedral of York, won't be finished until far into the 15th century. This is Fountains Abbey, also in Yorkshire. It's mostly 13th century, but the tower at the end of the north transept was added in the 15th. It's remarkable for the width of the east end, but as I've mentioned, in England there was much less emphasis on height. You can see that the east window was truly enormous here, and that the flying buttresses, which are so much a part of the Gothic style in France, are completely absent. This is Tintern Abbey now, another Cistercian building. This is where Wordsworth wrote, "I have felt a presence that disturbs me with the joy of elevated thoughts, a sense sublime of something far more deeply interfused, whose dwelling is the light of setting suns, the round ocean, and the mind of man." But Henry VIII was only moved to baser thoughts of how much money he could get for it. So Rievaulx, Fountains, and Tintern were monasteries. This now is the Cathedral of Lincoln. The English cathedrals, unlike what were supposed to be the corrupt monasteries, were not wrecked in the Reformation. Even if the earliest Gothic parts of the Cathedral of Canterbury are earlier than the Gothic parts of Lincoln, the latter here was finished by the end of the 13th century, well before Canterbury was. It is therefore among the earliest cathedrals in England to be essentially completed in the Gothic style, although the central part of the facade with the big round arches is 12th century and Romanesque or Norman. This is the east end of Lincoln now, with the typical flat English Gothic look derived, it is usually said, from the Cistercian style. Remember that even in France, Cistercian churches, like Fontenay, which we saw, typically had flat east ends like this. This is the interior of Lincoln now, looking toward the choir screen, which, like the flat east end and the crossing tower, is another typical English feature. Notice also the width of the nave, which is wide even for an English church, and looking up at the vault you can see the first use of ribs with a purely decorative purpose. Some of those ribs are just attached to the vault, and so it supports them rather than the other way around. This is the first step toward making English vaults so complex they'll look like stone spider webs by the 15th century. One of the great intellectual and moral figures in England in the last part of the 12th century was St. Hugh of Lincoln, who was buried where that monument stands. A former Carthusian monk, he became the Bishop of Lincoln with the support of Henry II, and he is usually considered to have been the primary architect of the cathedral as it now stands. He was also a mathematician and an astronomer, but he stands out especially for his defense of the moral, if not legal, rights of the common people and the Jews. More than once, single-handedly, he stopped riots against the latter. John Ruskin thought him the most beautiful religious figure in the whole history of the organized church. From 1235 until his death, Robert Grosseteste was Bishop of Lincoln, and he was buried here in the cathedral. One of the great scholars of the age, he is famous for his translations of and commentaries on Aristotle, and served as Chancellor of the University of Oxford before taking the job here. This is the Cathedral of Wells, another example of the early English Gothic style, and one of the best because it's relatively small and stylistically uniform, having been essentially completed in only about 75 years. This is the interior now, looking east toward the kind of thing that's called a strainer arch, meant to help support the crossing tower. It produces a dramatic effect, but its functional value is argued about. The nave is only 67 feet high here, and that's about average for such churches in England, where, as I've said, there was not the same emphasis on height we saw in France. Like Wells, the Cathedral of Salisbury is another especially interesting example of English 13th century Gothic because of its stylistic uniformity. It's one of the few churches anywhere of its size to have been finished according to the plans of the original architect, in this case Bishop Richard de la Poer. It was begun in 1220 and finished in 1320 and has suffered no major alterations since. Its crossing tower is the highest in England at 404 feet, but it is leaning dangerously. This is the interior now. In Germany, there are few Gothic churches which make it into the art history books. The most impressive cathedrals there are mostly still Romanesque, like Worms and Spire, which we've seen. This is the nave of the Cathedral of Bamberg, which has one of the earliest Gothic naves in Germany, and it is a good deal plainer than the more elegant examples we've seen in France and England. In the distance, you can see the so-called Bamberg Knight, the result of one of the more ambitious sculptural efforts of the 13th century. And you're hearing a hymn by the famous German nun Hildegard von Bingen. The hymn is O Virga Mediatrix. Here you see the knight up closer. His legs are too short and the horse looks a little stiff, but this is the first real attempt to put a man on a horse or make anything else this big and freestanding in stone since the fall of Rome. It may be that he is supposed to be a real man, one of the emperors perhaps, but there's no hard evidence to support any identification. Some of the most impressive examples of medieval German sculpture are in the west choir of the Cathedral of Naumburg. These figures represent Eckhard, the founder of the city, and his wife Uta. They aren't portraits of the people they represent, who lived in the 11th century, but they certainly look like portraits of somebody. The artist must have modeled them on two of his own contemporaries who perhaps posed for him. Uta is especially memorable. If there were a Miss Middle Ages beauty pageant, she'd get my vote, I think. So Bamberg is early German Gothic, and the Cathedral of Cologne here now is late. It was begun in 1248, and the western part of the nave and the towers are very, very late since they weren't finished till the 19th century. It has the highest pair of towers anywhere at 515 feet, although the single spire of the Cathedral of Ulm is 528. This is the nave, and it's the highest of any Gothic church at 154 feet. That's about twice as high as the vault of a typical English cathedral. Here's another romantic look at the Cathedral of Cologne now, and this is where the sun's going to set on the age of castles and cathedrals. Next time we'll start the series on the Renaissance in the Italian Middle Ages. So arrivederci.